G'day guys, ZiggyD here. With Path of Exile's 3.0 expansion, The Fall of Oriath, Damage Over Time Ailments, Bleed, Ignite and Poison were all redesigned. The mechanics have changed quite a bit, and this has had major implications in how you build ailment-focused characters. In this series of guides I'll explain how the new system works, and how you can best scale Bleed, Ignite and Poison. If you're a new player looking to expand your knowledge, or a returning player unsure about the changes, then this guide should get you familiar with how it all works. Firstly, let's talk about the keyword ailments. Ailments include bleeding and poison, as well as the elemental ailments Ignite, Chill, Freeze and Shock. The distinction between elemental and regular ailments is important because some mechanics, like the Crystal Skin passive, gives avoidance of specifically elemental ailments. Elemental ailments are also applied on a critical hit, while bleeding and poison are not. Score a critical hit with a fireball and the enemy will be ignited, crit with an ice spear and they'll be frozen, and so on. Now before we move on, I want to talk to the existing player base who wants to adapt over to the 3.0 system. So for this is for you guys looking to understand the difference between the old and new systems. If you're a fairly new player to Path of Exile joining in 3.0, then you should probably just skip this section to avoid confusion. Damage over time ailments are now no longer based on the damage of the hit that inflicted them. Previously, if you dealt 1000 fire damage, your burn would be based on that, and you'd deal 200 fire damage per second that would then be scaled up again by fire damage, elemental damage, and so on. Now in 3.0 and beyond, your ignite damage is a completely separate thing, and is even referenced on its own line in your character sheet. What this means is that the phrase double dipping has gone the way of the dinosaurs. It's dead and gone forever. There is literally no way to double dip your damage scaling modifiers, as the hit damage and the ailment damage over time are completely independent from each other. If you're still confused, try to forget everything you know about damage over time in Path of Exile, and continue on with the following sections of this guide as if you were learning the mechanics for the first time. Because that's basically what you need to do, the new system is completely different. Alright, so now let's talk about how ailment damage is calculated. Damage over time ailments are calculated by taking the relevant base and added damage, adjusting it based on skill modifiers, converting it to the ailment damage, and then scaling it up with any relevant modifiers. Base damage for attacks is the flat damage on your weapon, scaled by local modifiers, for example the physical damage on your bow and the local increased physical damage mods. Base damage for spells, on the other hand, is the listed damage on the skill gem, for example the 283 to 424 fire damage on a level 15 fireball gem. Added damage is any other sources of added flat damage. For bleed and poison, this can be things like iron rings, abyssus, or the chance to bleed support. For ignite, this could be things like added flat fire damage from the anger aura, jewelry, or even added fire damage support, which adds flat fire damage based on base physical damage. Damage conversion can apply to both the base and added damage, like Avatar of Fire converting half of your bow's physical damage as well as half of the physical damage gained from steel rings into fire damage. The next important thing to know is skill modifiers. Skills can have two specific modifiers that affect how much ailment damage you will deal, a base damage modifier and an effectiveness of added damage modifier. Base damage modifiers apply to attack skills and affect how much of your weapon damage is used. Some skills scale your base weapon damage down, usually due to a large area or multiple hits, like Barrage or Blade Flurry. Others instead scale them up, usually because they're intended to be strong single target skills. Effectiveness of added damage is the same as the base damage modifier on attacks, but on spells it's far more important to note. Firestorm, for example, has a 30% effectiveness of added damage modifier because it has many hits per cast and a large area of effect. If you're trying to ignite with Firestorm, any added fire damage is going to be first scaled down by this 30% effectiveness multiplier. As a result, lots of small hits and a small effectiveness multiplier, Firestorm potentially not very good for ignites. Do note that if no effectiveness multiplier is listed on a skill gem, then it's at default 100%. So once your base and added damage is scaled by skill modifiers, it is then converted into ailment damage. The exact conversion depends on the ailment. For example, Ignite is 40% of base and added fire damage per second for 4 seconds. From there you can scale the ailment damage over time using a variety of passives, supports, and gear mods. If you want to understand more specifically how each of the 3 dot ailments work, then I'm going to be making separate guides for them, and you can also find linked in the description below a link to a text document that I've written. Next up, I want to talk about critical strikes with ailments, because this has changed as well. There is now a new modifier in the game called Damage Multiplier for Ailments from Critical Strikes. This is a 150% multiplier by default, so when you critically strike with a hit applying an ailment, your ailment damage is multiplied by 150% or 1.5. Now it's important to note, regular critical strike multiplier does not increase this modifier, but with the new Perfect Agony keystone, 30% of your critical strike multiplier can be converted to damage multiplier for ailments from critical strikes. It's a bit of a mouthful, but put simply, there are two separate crit multi mods now, one for regular hits and one for ailments. You can convert regular crit multi into ailment crit multi with Perfect Agony. We may also see additional ways of obtaining ailment crit multi added in the future, but for now that's it. So how do you deal even more damage to enemies with ailments? Well, besides scaling up the ailment damage you do, you can also make the enemies take extra damage from them as well. Shocking the enemy, cursing them with vulnerability, and lowering their relevant resistance can all increase the ailment damage they take. Other effects like Intimidate from a champion, which makes enemies take 10% increased damage, also works. It's a bit easier under the new system to actually just understand what things don't scale the damage of ailments post 3.0. For returning players, there are a lot of things that used to scale your damage over times in some way, but no longer do, so this section is super important. So here's a list of things that don't scale ailments. Increased damage with any weapon type. The quote-unquote attack damage, or variants of, such as increased physical attack damage. Increased melee damage, projectile damage, area damage, spell damage. And of course, additional critical strike multiplier if you don't have Perfect Agony. Assassin's Mark extra damage on critical strike cannot apply to ailment damage even with Perfect Agony. Double damage on hit mechanics, things like Weight of Empire's Heavy Strike, which has a 20% chance to deal damage, that doesn't work with ailments either. Point Blank, and also similarly Chin Soul's Point Blank effect. Elemental Penetration, since the damage is not based on the hit, but a separate ailment damage, you can't actually penetrate with it. Similarly, Inquisitor's Ignore Enemy Elemental Resistances doesn't apply to ignites. And finally, it's also important to note that armor does not mitigate bleed. However, hard physical damage mitigations, things like endurance charges and immortal call, can actually mitigate the physical damage over time from bleeding. Though this 3.0 system presents a limited array of scaling options, ZiggyD added specific ailment damage scaling to most weapon clusters as an additional stat. So while you may not get the 25% increased physical damage with axes from the Slaughter node, it also has 25% increased damage with ailments from attack skills while wielding an axe. Now the final thing you can do to scale your ailments is to increase their duration. Ailments all have a built-in duration that they will affect the enemy for. This can be modified in some cases, like with the Dirty Techniques passive near Duelist, which gives 20% increased bleed and poison duration. However, it is important to note that ailments are not considered skill effects. As such, modifiers to skill effect duration do not apply to ailments, such as the increased duration support gem or the Potency of Will passive cluster. However, this is Path of Exile and there are always exceptions to the rule. The exceptions in this case are Viper Strike and Puncture skills, which both have a base duration built into them that overrides the default one. The bleed applied by Puncture and the poison by Viper Strike both are considered skill effects and as such can be modified by skill effect duration. The other things you can do to extend the duration of an ailment on an enemy is to curse them with temporal chains, which makes the effects on cursed target enemies expire slower, therefore they take damage for longer. Hopefully this guide has helped clear up any confusion you may have had about the new ailment system. In future videos I'd like to explore the specific mechanics and scaling options available to bleed, poison and ignite individually. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. That's it for now, I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.